On a Tuesday morning in September of 1992, Frank Donnelly stood at the edge of a swamp and watched his career sink into the mud. 3 days, that was how long his $600,000 Caterpillar 375 excavator had been sinking into the black earth of Clayton County, Iowa. Not fast, not all at once, just slowly, steadily, inch by inch. The machine had punched through what the surveyors guaranteed was solid ground and dropped like a stone into the bottomless muck beneath. Now it sat in that swamp like a wounded dinosaur, buried to its cab, its yellow paint streaked with mud, its tracks completely invisible beneath the surface. Every hour it seemed to sink another inch. Frank was 45 years old and had built Donnelly Construction from nothing. One backhoe, one pickup truck, 18-hour days for 20 straight years until he was the biggest contractor in eastern Iowa. He employed 150 men. He had equipment worth millions. He had built bridges, highways, shopping centers, and schools across 3 counties and never once failed to deliver. Frank Donnelly was not a man who ran out of options. But on that Tuesday morning, that is exactly where he stood. On the first day, he brought in 2 Caterpillar D8 bulldozers and chained them to the stuck excavator's frame. They pulled until their own tracks started to slip, until the chains groaned under unbearable stress. Then one chain snapped with a sound like a gunshot that sent 3 workers diving to the ground. The excavator had not moved a single inch. On the second day, Frank called a recovery company from Des Moines, specialists, men who did nothing but extract heavy equipment from impossible situations. They arrived with a 50-ton winch truck and anchored it to a concrete foundation half a mile from the swamp's edge. The winch screamed, the cable stretched tight as a piano wire. Then the anchor tore clean out of the ground, the cable recoiled across the field like a whip, and the excavator sank another 6 inches as if registering its contempt for the effort. On the third day, Frank rented a crane. The crane operator drove to the site, climbed down, walked to the swamp's edge, looked at the ground beneath his boots for 30 seconds and shook his head. He said 4 words. "That ground won't hold." Frank asked what he meant. "You want 2 machines stuck instead of 1, the man said. Then he climbed back into his crane and drove away without looking back. Now Frank stood with his engineers in the mud and nobody had anything left to say. They had tried brute force. They had tried specialists. They had tried the crane. The excavator was still sinking. "What about a helicopter?" one engineer finally said. "A skycrane could lift it." "A skycrane costs $15,000 an hour," Frank said. "The nearest one is in Minnesota. By the time it gets here, that machine will be underground. We could drain the swamp." "That swamp is fed by an underground spring. A month and $1 million and we still might not get ahead of the water." "Insurance." Frank laughed, short, bitter. "Insurance doesn't cover operator error, and driving into a swamp counts as operator error." The engineers fell silent. Not one of them had another idea. The only sound was the faint sucking noise the swamp made around the excavator's cab. That was the moment the old John Deere tractor came rattling up the access road. Frank heard it before he saw it, the familiar put-put of a diesel engine that had been running for a very long time. He turned and saw a green tractor pulling up to the edge of the site, driven by a man who looked like he had been grown in the Iowa soil himself. Old overalls, mud-caked work boots, a face that had seen 50 years of weather and hadn't bothered to hide any of it. The man shut off the tractor, climbed down slowly and walked over to where Frank stood with his engineers. "Morning," the man said. Frank barely glanced at him. "Morning, sites closed to visitors, insurance liability." "I'm not a visitor, I'm your neighbor, own the land on the other side of that tree line." He nodded toward the swamp. "Saw your problems, thought I might be able to help." Frank looked at him, really looked at him. The worn overalls, the mud on his boots, the hands of someone who had never pushed paper for a living. "Helped how?" "I can pull that out." The words sat in the air. One engineer glanced at another, someone coughed, and then Frank Donnelly started to laugh. "Let me tell you about that laugh, because it matters." It was not mean, exactly. It was the laugh of a man who has done everything and seen everything and arrived at a place where he cannot imagine being surprised. The laugh of someone who looks at a 73-year-old farmer in worn overalls and sees a category rather than a person. The laugh of a man who has spent 20 years proving he is smarter than the room and has started to believe it without checking. "You can pull that out," Frank repeated. "With what, Grandpa? Your John Deere, that excavator weighs 60 tons. Not with the John Deere, the man said. His voice was completely level. No embarrassment, no hurry with my steamer. Your what? My steam traction engine, case, 1912 model, 110 horsepower. She's been in my family for 80 years. The laughter spread from Frank to the engineers to the workers who had stopped to watch. The whole site was chuckling at the old man who wanted to pull a $600,000 excavator out of a swamp with a machine built the same year the Titanic went down. A steam tractor from 1912, Frank said, wiping his eyes. You want to pull out my $600,000 excavator with a steam tractor from 1912. That's right. I've got bulldozers on this site that make more horsepower than your whole farm. They couldn't move that excavator an inch. What makes you think some antique does better? The old man looked at the stuck excavator, then at the useless bulldozer at the swamp's edge, then back at Frank with the patience of a man who has been right about things for a very long time. Your machines make horsepower, he said. Mine makes torque. There's a difference. Enlighten me. Horsepower is how fast you can do work. Torque is how much work you can do. Your bulldozers spin fast but they can't grip. They're designed for pushing dirt on solid ground. My steamer was designed to pull thrashing machines through muddy fields all day long. 6-foot drive wheels with steel cleats, weighs 22 tons herself. She doesn't spin. A pause, she grips. Frank shook his head. This is adorable, but I've got a real problem and I don't have time. You've had 3 days, the old man said quietly. Just that, not loudly, not with any edge, just the plain fact of it sitting in the September air. You've tried the bulldozers, the winch company, a crane that wouldn't even get close. You're losing $20,000 a day. You're out of options. He let that settle. I'm not charging you anything. If it doesn't work, you've lost nothing but an hour. If it does work, you make a donation to the Clayton County Historical Society. They helped me restore that engine. Frank looked at his engineers. One shrugged, another tilted his head, the universal gesture for we have nothing better. Fine, Frank said, bring your museum piece. When it falls apart trying, at least it'll give my men something to laugh about. The old man nodded once, walked back to his John Deere, started it, and drove away without another word. His name was Walter Brennan, and before I tell you what happened next, I need to tell you who he was. Walter was 73 years old and had farmed the same 400 acres in Clayton County for 50 years. Born on that land, raised on it, never seriously considered leaving it. Not because he lacked imagination. Because the land was his and he was the land's, and that arrangement suited both parties. He was not a complainer. When the Donnelly crews arrived 6 months earlier, Walter watched them without a word. Watched them grade and pour concrete and bring in machines that cost more than his entire farm. He didn't complain when the noise scattered his cattle. Didn't complain when the construction traffic tore up the county road. Didn't complain when they told him to move his fence line because the survey had been wrong by 14 feet. Walter Brennan was a watcher. He observed carefully, concluded slowly, and held his conclusions firmly. For 3 days he had watched a $600,000 excavator sink while modern machinery and modern expertise accomplished nothing. He watched the bulldozers spin, watched the winch cable snap, watched the crane drive away. And the whole time he was watching, he was thinking about torque and traction and a machine sitting in a shed behind his barn that had been built for exactly this kind of problem. Now let me tell you about the steam engine, because it is the real hero of this story and it deserves a proper introduction. The Case 110 horsepower steam traction engine had been built in Racine, Wisconsin in 1912. The same year the Titanic sank. The same year Woodrow Wilson was elected president. It was a monster. 22 tons of iron and steel, rear drive wheels 6 feet in diameter, each one studded with heavy steel cleats designed to grip any surface on Earth. The boiler held 150 gallons of water and generated steam pressure that could move things with no intention of moving, built in an age when men designed machines for one thing: work, the kind that does not stop when the going gets hard. Walter's grandfather August Brennan had bought it new for $3,200 in 1912. In 1912, that was more than most farms in Clayton County cost, a bet the farm investment in the most literal sense. But August had seen what steam traction engines could do and understood the mathematics of that power on 160 Iowa acres, and he made the purchase without hesitation. For 20 years, the Case was the heart of the Brennan operation. August used it to pull thrashing machines from farm to farm during harvest season, hearing it out to neighbors who needed the power. He used it to drag stumps from fields being cleared, pulling out by the roots things that teams of horses would have broken themselves trying to move. When gasoline tractors became practical in the 1930s, most farmers scrapped their steamers. Simpler, faster, cheaper to run. The steam age ended almost overnight across the Midwest, but August couldn't do it, couldn't bring himself to scrap the machine that had built his farm. So he parked it in the shed behind the barn, covered it with canvas, and told himself he might need it again someday. He never did. August died in 1952, and the steam engine sat untouched for 32 more years. Walter rediscovered it in 1984 when he was cleaning out the old shed. He pulled back the canvas and found the engine exactly as his grandfather had left it. Dusty, surface rust, draped in cobwebs, but intact, every part present. The boiler still held pressure when he tested it. The gears still turned when he cranked them by hand, stiff at first, then finding their old rhythm like something waking from a long sleep. He spent 3 years restoring it. Found a retired machinist in Dubuque who remembered working on steamers in his youth. Tracked down original parts from collectors across the Midwest. Learned to operate it from factory manuals and from old men who still remembered the age of steam and talked about these engines the way other old men talk about old friends. By 1987, the case was running again. Walter fired it up in the yard and let out the whistle, and the sound rolled across 400 acres of Clayton County flatland like a voice from another century announcing it was not finished yet. He took it to county fairs after that, steam shows, demonstrated it for school groups, fired it up once a month to keep the seals from drying out just to hear the whistle carry across the fields the way it had when August was young. He had always known the machine was powerful, he had just never had a real job to give it. Not until a construction company drove a $600,000 excavator into a swamp 3 days ago and ran out of ideas. It took Walter 2 hours to fire up the engine. You cannot start a steamer like a modern tractor. You build a fire, you heat the water, you wait for pressure to climb through the gauges slowly, watching the numbers rise, respecting the process, because steam under pressure does not forgive impatience. Walter had done this hundreds of times and never once rushed it. By noon, the pressure was where it needed to be. Walter checked every valve one final time and drove the engine out of the shed onto the county road. 5 miles an hour. That is the speed of a steam traction engine driven by a man who understands what he is carrying. Black smoke from the stack. Small white jets of steam from the relief valves. The 6-foot drive wheels turning with the slow, absolute certainty of something that has never experienced insufficient traction. Each steel cleat gripping the gravel road and releasing it in a rhythm that sent vibration through the ground 20 feet in every direction. Cars pulled over, not because they were blocking traffic, because the sight of a 1912 K steam traction engine traveling a county road in 1992 made you stop whatever you were doing and look. 3 drivers got out of their cars entirely. 2 kids on bikes followed it for half a mile. A machine like this had not traveled these roads in 50 years. It was like watching something come back from the dead. The construction crew heard it before they saw it. First, the sound. A deep rhythmic chuffing like the controlled breathing of something enormous that was accustomed to hard work and in no distress about what was being asked of it. Then the vibration in the ground, the steel cleats biting into the access road, sending a pulse through the earth that every man felt through the soles of his boots. Then the whistle. Walter let it sound as he crested the small rise overlooking the site, a long high shriek of steam that cut across the Iowa afternoon and turned every head. The sound of the 19th century announcing itself to the 20th. And there was something in it that made the hair on your neck stand up if you were close enough to hear it clearly. The steam engine came over the rise and into view, and for a long moment nobody on that construction site made a sound. It was enormous. It dwarfed Walter's John Deere the way a grizzly bear dwarfs a house cat. The boiler gleamed black, freshly painted. The brass fittings caught the September sun and threw it back in small flashes of gold. The drive wheels, 6 feet in diameter, heavy steel cleats, turned with the slow, patient, absolute authority of something engineered to do one thing and doing it without complaint for 80 years. Frank Donnelly stood at the site's edge with his arms crossed, watching. His smile was still there, but it had gotten smaller. "Jesus Christ," one of the engineers said quietly, "look at the size of that thing." "It's an antique," Frank said, but the certainty in his voice had shifted just slightly. "Belongs in a museum," he added, as if saying it again could keep it true. Walter drove the steam engine to the swamp's edge about 200 feet from the stuck excavator and set the brake. He climbed down and walked to the back of the machine where a length of chain was coiled and secured, not a light chain, links as thick as a man's wrist. forged steel rated for 80 tons. "That chain won't hold," an engineer said. "We snapped a cable rated for 50 tons. "This chain is rated for 80, Walter said without looking up. "And it has give to it. Steel cable doesn't stretch. When it hits its limit, it snaps. Chain stretches a little before it breaks, gives you time to read the situation." He picked up the end of the chain, slung the coil over his shoulder, and walked toward the swamp. Every man on the site watched him go. He walked into the mud without pausing at the edge. His boots sank, the black muck pulling at them, releasing with a soft, sucking sound. He went into his ankles, his knees, his thighs. He kept walking, the chain over his shoulder, moving through the swamp at the same steady pace he used for everything else, as if being chest-deep in black mud was an unremarkable detail about an ordinary Tuesday. He hooked the chain to the excavator's main frame, checked the connection twice, and turned around and walked back through the swamp to solid ground. By the time he reached the steam engine, he was covered in black mud from the waist down. He didn't look at it. He climbed up onto the platform, checked his gauges, made 2 small adjustments, and put his right hand on the throttle. "You sure about this, old-timer?" Frank called. The mockery was gone from his voice now. Something more complicated had replaced it. "That machine is worth more than your whole farm." Walter looked at him. "If something goes wrong, I'll owe you an excavator." A pause. "Nothing's going to go wrong." He opened the throttle. "Let me tell you about the next 3 minutes, because they are the reason this story is still being told 30 years later." The sound the steam engine made when Walter opened the throttle was something nobody on that site had ever heard. Not strange or alarming. Old, deeply fundamentally old. A sound from before electronics, before hydraulics, before computers designed to stop machines from exceeding their limits. A deep resonant chunk as the pistons began to drive, as the gears engaged, as 80 years of engineering came to life under a September sky. The drive wheels began to turn. They did not spin. That is the critical thing. That is the thing every man watching understood the moment it happened, even if he couldn't articulate it technically. The bulldozers had spun. The winch had stretched and snapped. The modern machines had hit the limits of their traction and lost the argument with the mud. But these 6-foot wheels with their heavy steel cleats did not spin. Each cleat found the soft earth, pressed into it, found the firmer layer beneath, and held. The chain went from slack to taut in one slow, irresistible movement. In the cab of the stuck excavator, the dashboard rattled. The whole machine groaned, a deep metallic complaint from 60 tons of steel being asked to move after 3 days of stillness. The mud around the tracks shifted. The surface of the swamp rippled outward in a slow circle. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the excavator moved. Not much, an inch, maybe 2, but it moved, a visible, undeniable forward movement out of the hole that had held it for 3 days. Someone on the site said a word unsuitable for general broadcast, then silence. Walter did not react. He was watching the pressure gauge, listening to the engine, reading the machine the way a man reads a living thing, not through instruments alone but through feel and sound and 40 years of experience that lives in the hands and ears and the small of the back. He pushed the throttle a little further. The chuffing grew louder, the drive wheels turned faster. The steel cleats tore into the ground, throwing arcs of mud and soil behind them. The chain hummed with tension, a single sustained note you felt in your chest more than you heard it. The excavator moved again, a foot, then another foot, then 3 feet as the mud's grip began to break, the suction that had held the machine for 3 days losing coherence as the tracks broke the surface seal. The construction crew was shouting now, not organized shouting, the involuntary kind. The kind that happens when what your eyes are seeing is running slightly ahead of what your brain has accepted. They were watching a 60-ton machine being pulled out of a swamp by something their great-grandfathers had used, and there was something in it that hit them somewhere below the rational mind. 5 feet, 10 feet. The excavator was rising now, its tracks emerging black and dripping from the swamp, the mud releasing with a series of deep liquid sounds. 20 feet, 30. Walter pulled it another 60 feet past solid ground before he closed the throttle. He set the brake, checked his gauges, then reached up and pulled the whistle cord. The sound went across the flat Iowa afternoon like a voice. The same triumphant carrying cry that had announced thrashing crews on August mornings 100 years ago. The same sound that had echoed across these fields when Walter Brennan was young and men believed they had found in these iron machines a power that would never be exceeded. The construction crew erupted. Men who had been frozen in silence half a second earlier were cheering, grabbing each other, pointing at the steam engine and the freed excavator and the mud-covered old man who had done what $1 million worth of modern equipment could not do. Frank Donnelly did not cheer. He stood absolutely still, arms at his sides, face pale, the expression of a man whose understanding of how the world works is being quietly, completely, and permanently revised. He looked at the steam engine. He looked at his excavator sitting on solid ground for the first time in 72 hours. He looked at Walter Brennan standing on the platform of a machine from 1912, covered in black mud, checking his gauges with the calm of a man who had expected this outcome from the beginning. Frank Donnelly did not say a single word. Frank drove out to Walter's farm the next morning. Walter was in the barn cleaning mud from the steam engine's wheels when he heard the truck in the driveway. He kept working, did not turn around until Frank's shadow fell across the barn floor from the doorway. "Mr. Brennan." "Mr. Donnelly." Frank stood for a long moment, hands in his pockets, looking at the steam engine in the morning light. With the mud cleaned off and the brass catching the light, it looked different from yesterday. Less like a rescue machine, more like what it actually was, a complete, fully realized piece of engineering from an era that had understood some things about work and permanence that the current era had forgotten. "I came to apologize," Frank said. "Nothing to apologize for. I laughed at you in front of my whole crew, called your machine a museum piece, called you Grandpa. You did. I was wrong." Walter set down his brush and looked at Frank directly for the first time. "Yes, you were." Frank was quiet then. "How did you know? How did you know that machine could do what nothing else could?" Walter leaned against the steam engine's massive rear wheel, still warm from yesterday's fire. "My grandfather bought this machine in 1912, he said. "Used it for 20 years. He used to say that modern machines were built for speed, but his steamer was built for work. For the kind of work where you cannot go fast, where you just have to keep pulling until the job is done. But the technology is the same as it was 80 years ago. Steam and gears, shouldn't something more modern?" "The technology is exactly the same as it was 80 years ago," Walter said. "Steam pushing pistons, pistons turning gears, gears turning wheels, no computers to tell it when to stop, no sensors to protect it from overload, just pressure and steel and a man who understands them." He patted the boiler. "Your bulldozers make more horsepower than this machine, but horsepower wasn't what you needed. You needed torque, slow, steady, uninterrupted pulling power, wheels that grip instead of spin. A machine that doesn't know when to quit. And yours doesn't. Mine just pulls. The only computer is me, and I know when to stop and when to keep going." Frank was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, something had gone out of his voice, not confidence, something harder than confidence, a kind of armor he had been wearing so long he had stopped noticing its weight. "I spent 30 years in this business," he said. "Always believed that newer was better, that more technology meant more capability, that money and expertise could solve any problem." He looked at the steam engine. "Yesterday, a machine built before my grandfather was born did what $1 million of modern equipment could not do." "Your equipment is better for most things," Walter said. "Faster, more precise, easier to use. I am not saying old is always better. I am saying every tool has the work it was made for. The wisdom is knowing which tool fits which job." He looked at Frank evenly. "You stopped asking that question. You only knew how to spend money on the answer." Frank pulled out his checkbook. "The donation, how much? What did 3 days of delays cost you?" "Close to 70,000. "Give them 10,000. They've never seen money like that. They can use it to preserve machines like this one, machines people laugh at until they need them." Frank wrote the check without hesitating, handed it over. 10,000 to the Clayton County Historical Society, and my personal thanks." He paused. "I won't forget what you did." Walter took the check. "Most people forget." "I won't." Frank looked at the steam engine one last time. "You know what I figured out yesterday? My great-grandfather was smarter than me. He didn't have computers or hydraulics or any of the things I thought were essential. He just had machines like this and the knowledge of how to use them." "He was smarter than both of us," Walter said. "He built a world that worked, we just inherited it." Let me tell you about the years that followed, because Walter Brennan became something he never planned to become. Not television famous, not nationally known. Famous the way things become famous in rural counties, slowly, by word of mouth, in the way a true story travels when the people who witnessed it are still alive to tell it. The Des Moines Register sent a reporter within 2 weeks. A television crew came from Cedar Rapids the week after. By the end of October, the story had run in 3 newspapers, 2 TV segments, and a magazine feature about vintage technology finding new relevance. Walter gave the same interview every time, patient and precise, explaining torque and traction and the difference between machines built for speed and machines built for work. The phone started ringing. Construction companies, logging operations, farmers with equipment stuck in places nothing modern could reach. Most jobs were too far away. Walter was not going to drive a steam engine to Minnesota, but the local ones he never turned down. Over the 5 years following the swamp rescue, Walter and his 1912 case pulled 11 pieces of heavy modern equipment out of situations that modern technology could not resolve. 2 more excavators, a bulldozer that went through ice on a frozen pond in February, a concrete truck in a drainage ditch, 4 grain trucks in wet fields during bad harvests, and 3 combines belonging to the same farming operation that got stuck in the same low corner of the same field in 3 consecutive years. After the third one, Walter looked at the farmer and said simply, "You might want to think about draining that corner before next harvest." He never charged for any of it. Every rescue ended the same way, a donation to the Clayton County Historical Society, whatever the person felt was right. By 1997, the society had enough money to build a proper museum building dedicated to preserving the steam-powered equipment that had built the agricultural Midwest. Walter's case was the centerpiece. Not permanently, Walter kept the monthly runs and the steam shows, but the museum built a dedicated display with historical photographs and written testimonials from the people Walter had helped. At the center stood a bronze plaque. It read, "Case Steam Traction Engine 1912. Owner, Walter Brennan, Clayton County, Iowa." This machine was constructed before the First World War and remains in full working order today. It has recovered over $1 million worth of modern equipment from situations that modern technology could not resolve. Some things do not become obsolete, they wait for people to remember why they were built. Walter Brennan died in September of 2001. He was 82 years old. His son Martin found him on the porch of the farmhouse on a quiet morning, a cup of cold coffee in his hand, his face at rest. From that porch you could see the shed through the gap in the tree line. The steam engine was visible in there the way it had always been visible from that spot. August had parked it there in 1932. Walter had parked it there in 1987 when he brought it back. It sat in the September morning, quiet and waiting, as permanent in that landscape as the tree line itself. The funeral was the largest Clayton County had seen in 20 years. Frank Donnelly came, older, grayer, but still running his construction company and still telling the story of the swamp rescue to anyone who would listen. "This man saved my business," Frank said at the reception. "Not just my excavator, my business, my reputation. I was hemorrhaging money and losing credibility by the hour, and an old farmer with an older machine did what every engineer and specialist I called could not do." He paused. "I've told that story 1,000 times, I'll tell it 1,000 more." Martin Brennan had grown up on the farm and grown up with the steam engine, learned to operate it beside his father. Learned the patience required to build steam, the attention required to maintain safe pressure, the feel of the throttle under load. When Walter died, Martin took it all without ceremony. The farm, the engine, the monthly runs, the phone calls. The first time he fired it up after the funeral, he drove it into the yard and stood on the platform before pulling the whistle cord. When the sound went out over the flatland, he stood very still for a moment. Later he would say the sound was the same as it had always been and also not the same, that there was something in it he had not heard before, or perhaps had always heard but never had a reason to name. In the spring of 2015, 23 years after the original swamp rescue, Martin got a phone call from a construction site on the eastern edge of Clayton County. The caller was Daniel Donnelly, Frank's grandson. He had inherited the family construction company 2 years earlier and had the same name and the same drive and the same absolute confidence his grandfather had possessed before a September morning in 1992 adjusted it permanently. A Caterpillar excavator had gone through what the surveyors guaranteed was solid ground and sunk to its cab in a swamp. 2 bulldozers had failed, a winch truck had failed, a crane had refused to approach the edge. 3 days. Martin drove the steam engine to the site at 5 miles an hour. Daniel Donnelly stood at the swamp's edge watching the machine come over the rise with the exact expression Frank Donnelly had worn in 1992. Disbelief and amusement and the particular condescension of a man who has grown up with modern machines and cannot take seriously anything that predates hydraulics. "Your grandfather warned me about this swamp," Daniel said, watching the steam engine pull his excavator clear. His expression had been changing during the pull in stages, the way eyes adjust from brightness to dark. He said the only thing that could get equipment out of here was your family's machine. What did you say when he told you that? I said that was ridiculous. That was 1992. We have better technology now. Martin looked at him, and how did that work out for you? The young man watched the excavator settle onto solid ground, tracks black and dripping. 60 tons of modern machine dragged free by a machine from before the First World War. He was quiet for a moment. About like you'd expect, he said. Martin shut down the engine, checked his gauges, then reached up and pulled the whistle cord one last time. The sound rolled out over the Iowa flatland, the same sound that had rolled over these same fields for over 100 years. My grandfather was right, Daniel said quietly. Some things don't become obsolete, they just wait for people to forget, and then they remind us. The 1912 case steam traction engine is still running. Martin Brennan still fires it up once a month on a Sunday morning, building the fire and watching the pressure climb and driving it into the yard to let the engine find its rhythm. Still takes it to the county fairs and the steam shows. Still answers the phone when someone calls about equipment stuck somewhere that nothing modern can reach. His daughter Emma learned to drive it on her 16th birthday. She stood on the platform and put her hands on the throttle and felt the vibration of steam moving through old iron, and Martin watched her face change the way his face had changed and his father's face before that. The engineers say that steam power is ancient history. The professors say it in their lectures. The people who design modern equipment say it in the confident language of people who have never needed something their equipment could not provide. But in Clayton County, Iowa, there is a shed behind a barn where a 1912 case steam traction engine sits waiting. Its boiler still holds pressure. Its gears still turn. Its 6-foot drive wheels with their heavy forged steel cleats can still grip any surface on Earth and refuse to release it until the job is done. It has been there for over 100 years. It has outlasted the age that built it, outlasted the men who built it, outlasted the assumptions of every engineer who ever looked at it and said museum piece and meant it as a dismissal. Every time someone stands at the edge of a swamp and says nothing can pull that out, the Brennan family fires up the engine, lets the pressure build, and drives down the county road at 5 miles an hour. And proves them wrong. That is the story of the swamp rescue. The engineers laughed, the steam whistle answered, the excavator came out of the mud. That is what happens when you underestimate something that was built to last.